Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Jeff Alpaugh, Marsh's growth and industry leader for US and Canada. So welcome back to Marsh's continuing series on the COVID-19 pandemic and other critical risks for businesses. We hope you're all safe and healthy, and again, we appreciate you being with us today. During today's webcast, we're going to focus on crisis management. The last several weeks and months have underscored how important it is for businesses to prepare for unpredictable events. We'll talk about how you can manage uncertainty, build trust as you engage with key stakeholders, incorporate recent lessons learned into your plans, and improve your organization's resilience. For our panel discussion today, I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Diermeier. Daniel is a leading crisis management expert, and next month will become Vanderbilt University's 9th chancellor. And Daniel is also one of my favorite professors of all time. We're also joined by Renata Elias. Renata is a vice president in the risk consulting practice within Marsh Risk Consult. And after we wrap up today's presentation, we'll focus on Q&A. And we're going to be joined by other colleagues, including Stephen Frazier. Steve is Marsh's U.S. casualty claims leader, and Dr. Lorna Friedman. Lorna is the global health leader within Mercer's multinational client group. And we have Greg Rodway. Greg is a senior vice president in the workforce strategies practice within Marsh Risk Consulting. We also have Dennis Tierney. Dennis is the claims director within Marsh's Workers' Compensation Center of Excellence. So let's move to slide 5. And I want to again encourage each and every one of you to submit questions during the course of our program using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. And if we don't have the answer to your question today, someone will get back to you soon. You can also email any questions about today's presentation to questions@marsh.com. But please note that if you're looking for information on how to access the replay of this webcast, we'll be sending that information out to each of you within the next 24 hours after we wrap up today. So let's start the program with a quick update on the situation. In the US and abroad, large-scale social equality protests following the deaths of George Floyd and other African Americans continue to be organized in major cities. Curfews have been now put in place in many cities, including New York, and those curfews have now been lifted. COVID-19, meanwhile, remains a significant threat. In the US, we recently passed a grim milestone of 2 million cases that have now been reported by the CDC, and more than 115,000 people have died. Globally, 7.8 million cases have been reported according to the World Health Organization, and more than 430,000 people have died from the disease. States and communities continue to reopen, but we're seeing significant differences in how these numbers are trending. The map that you can see on your screen right now shows where cases are trending up in the red and down in the green, so positive to the green over the last several weeks based on the data from Johns Hopkins University. The darker the red or the darker the green color in each state shows the significance of the trend in each of those states. So you can now see really positive trends in some states, but also troubling news elsewhere. With that out of the way, let's discuss today's session with Dr. Daniel Diermeier, a leading crisis management expert who will become the chancellor of Vanderbilt University. Daniel, so we've seen protests against racism and police brutality in the past. This is not a new phenomenon. What's different, what are you seeing that's different today about what we've seen in the past? So how are things different today? Over to you, Dr. Daniel Diermeier.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for the nice introduction, and great pleasure to be with you today. What the country is facing right now are 3 crises at the same time. There's a public health crisis, there's an economic crisis, and then there is a social and political crisis. You can argue moral crisis as well. And these things reinforce each other. But to really understand why this has become the biggest example of protests really since the 60s, one needs to understand a little bit more about how things are perceived by the public and what drives attention, which eventually then can create protest activity. So what's really crucial here is to understand how media coverage works and how it shapes and frames a particular issue. When you look at media coverage in general, that's true for traditional and social media. It has kind of two aspects to it. The first one is audience interest. So the more we are interested in a particular issue, the more the likelihood of coverage goes up. And that depends on the situation and also on the market. So that's the amount of coverage that you see. And then the second piece on the right-hand side is societal significance. That doesn't determine which issues and how much they're covered, but how they're covered, whether they are mere descriptions of facts and events, or whether they have advocacy, position taking, where the news media either implicitly or explicitly takes a position on an issue. If we go to the next slide, we'll put the two pieces together, and that allows you now to see different segments that drive news coverage. In this green area there, this is low audience interest, low societal significance, standard business coverage, Wall Street Journal, page 38, not anything that usually triggers a crisis. If you go then to this light blue area, increasing audience interest, that's typically where businesses are not located. This is where sports is located or entertainment. Again, not anything that triggers a crisis per se. And then on the other extreme, on the red side, this is where important social issues are discussed. But as long as an issue is located over there, it also doesn't lead to a crisis, largely because these are complex, complicated issues and audience interest is limited. So these three areas do not usually have the type of crisis potential that we're talking about. Where you do get it is what I call mass market coverage there, which is this darker blue area. And that you have the two factors at the same time. You have high audience interest and high societal significance. So let's see how this works in the George Floyd case and the aftermath. First of all, we of course have extremely high societal significance, always with respect to discrimination, racism, and that has been further highlighted because of the widely covered health inequities that are a consequence of COVID-19. So in some municipalities, in Chicago, for example, African Americans have died at a rate of 6 to 1. And so that has just broad perceptions of equalities, made it very clear that we're dealing with a setting, with a society where there are a lot of inequalities. This is not some abstract economic discussion. It's very concrete. It's about life and death. And now add to that the audience interest triggered by the George Floyd killing. So we had a gruesome video. The video and the visuals is one example that always drives up audience interest. If it's just a report, if you don't have video coverage, audience interest is usually smaller. And of course, the particularly horrific nature of that increased the audience interest even more. So you have very high societal significance, you have very high audience interest. Once you are in this category, in the mass market coverage, not only does the amount change, and not only is societal significance enhanced, but the second piece that's important here is that how we talk about an issue changes. We now no longer talk about subtle issues of economics or what do we do at a systemic from a policy point of view. We talk a story, and the story is often a morality tale, where you have a hero, a villain, and a victim. And of course, the dramatic nature of George Floyd's killing, how he was killed, the kind of the callousness and cruelty that was part of that further highlighted the role of the victim and really brought forward in a very emotional and dramatic fashion the sense that African Americans are in general victimized due to racism. So not only in this case, but it just kind of generalized then to a broader concern that of course has been there in society throughout the point. So the important piece from a risk management point of view is to appreciate once policy is used, move into a crisis areas. They can be dormant or they can become in waves, but it's very important that you understand how society significant increases here due to COVID-19 and the health inequities. And then once you have a video like the George Floyd killing, that dramatically increases audience interest. Now you're in a mass market coverage area. Now we are talking about these issues, not abstractly as policy experts, but from the point of view of who's the villain, who's the victim, and what do we do to save and protect people that are being victimized. So that's a very important way to understand, and a tool that you can use in a whole variety of different areas. Let's go to the next slide, Jeff.
Yeah, so Daniel, so in light of the trends that you just mentioned, are being asked to step up in so many different ways. Best way to keep for the businesses that are on the and risk managers and CFOs, general counsels, leadership, what is the best way to engage key stakeholders?
Well, the first thing I think that you have to really think about is how this particular crisis is different. And how this crisis is different, the COVID-19 crisis, and this is now broadly having to do with the health policy side and the economic consequences. It's characterized by a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and that uncertainty is profound and it's persistent. That's number one. The second piece that's important to understand is that we are dealing with an environment where fear is prevalent. So these are very important characteristics of this particular crisis. Uncertainty is always true in a crisis, but this one has, the uncertainty is deeper and it's much more persistent. I mean, literally, we don't know whether there will be a second wave. There's constantly changing public health information and so forth. So when it comes now to engage stakeholders, what companies need to do is they need to understand what's in their head. And the two most important things you're gonna have to watch out at this point is to make sure you maintain trust, and secondly, that you deal with the issue of fear. So the important thing about maintaining trust is how you talk about an issue will have a dramatic impact on whether you're trusted or not. This is sometimes counterintuitive for us because we are used to having answers. We think that in order to deal with uncertainty, in order to maintain trust, we have to have a solution ready. But that is not available right now. Very often, we don't know what the fall is like, certainly in my context at the university, where there's still a lot of moving pieces. So you have to ask yourself how you communicate that you maintain trust, even though you have not have a solution that of how to deal with COVID-19 in the long run. And what this trust radar shows you here are 4 different dimensions that can help you to increase trust. The first one is transparency. Transparency is not the same thing as full disclosure. Transparency is about understanding what is in people's heads and how to address that. So that you want to understand what are the questions that people have, tell them what you know, tell them what you don't know. And if you can't talk about something, for example, because of privacy concerns, let's say you cannot disclose which particular person has been infected in an office or in a university, then you want to tell them that as well. So the important piece in transparency, think for what's in their head, and then try to address that. And that will be different for a customer or a shareholder or an employee. So that's number one, transparency. Second important piece is expertise. Expertise breeds trust. This is usually not a problem for businesses, but in the case of COVID-19, it is. Because dealing with public health emergencies is not typically a core competency for most companies, unless you're in the healthcare sector. So in this particular case, bringing people in that have third-party expertise can really help to deal with the potential challenges that come with the perceived lack of expertise. My sense, however, is that people are still pretty, I don't want to say forgiving, but the standards are not quite as high on the expertise side. So companies are given a sense that we have a general expectation of that they should handle this, but not all the specifics. So again, bringing third parties in and then dealing with the crisis in an effective manner, that can be effective. The third factor is commitment. Commitment is people want to see a solution. And if you don't have a solution right now, the way you signal commitment is by by either showing up in person or by having processes. Processes means to have a task force in place that helps you dealing with the specific challenges, that allows you to show people what you're doing, and give updates on that. Processes create a sense of trust. And then the second thing is to make it personal. Video messages are better than emails, and virtual town halls are better than video messages. So the more you can make a sense of personal and maintain a connection there, the better. The last piece here is very important and often overlooked by companies and by managers, which is the need to maintain empathy. Connect with people's pain, with their own sense of uncertainty, with their sense of fear that they have. So you always want to do that and connect with, whether you're dealing with customers, whether you're doing with your own people, to make sure that it's done in an empathetic fashion. So these are 4 tools that help you with trust, which is a very important component in an environment of extreme uncertainty. The second piece has to do with fear. If we go to the next slide, please. So this is unusual for this crisis. You have it in some other crises too, for example, safety crisis. But of course, the persistent dimension of fear here is very profound. The important piece to recognize, again, is to start with what's in people's head, how they're perceiving a particular issue. And what that means is that how people experience risk or fear is not consistent with the objective reality. People overestimate risk or they underestimate risk. That's why we have seatbelt laws. People are still underestimating the risk in a car crash. What we know, and the research on that has been over the last 20 years, really created a whole bunch of very robust insights that there are aspects or characteristics of a situation that can increase fear or decrease fear. So here are 5 factors that are particularly relevant in the context of COVID-19. If an issue is novel, if it is unusual, if it is dreadful, if it has bad consequences like death, if there are identifiable victims, that's crucial, not numbers, but identifiable victims, and if there's a lot of news coverage, the risk perception goes up and people may be very fearful, maybe even panicky. The 5th factor is powerlessness. So if people have an experience of powerlessness, then they also are perceiving their risk higher. This is interesting, for example, in car accidents. People are much more afraid of being hit by a car than of turning over, flipping over. So people have the illusion that when they're driving themselves, they are less likely to have an accident than if they're hit from the side, where they are basically a victim and this feels like they can do nothing about it. It turns out, statistically speaking, accident rates are roughly equal. So one reason for why people love to buy SUVs, because they give them a sense of protection from side impact collisions, which are more fearful, more scary to people, but they trade-off stability of the vehicle if you're making a wrong turn and you flip over. So even to consumer behavior, do we see these factors at play? So how do they play into COVID-19? Very novel, very unusual, very dreadful, many identifiable victims. Every time CNN has a particular story about somebody, fear goes up, and of course, enormously salient. It seems like we're not talking about anything else, certainly not until the George Floyd killings. So there's not much you can do about this as manager. The only one, I think, where you will see some changes is on novelty. That over time, people just get used to things, which can be bad too in a public health crisis, because people will start not being as watchful anymore in their own behavior, not responsible. But where leader can make a difference is with a sense of powerlessness. So an important piece here is for leaders to make sure that their people have a sense of making a contribution. So you want to empower people. You want to talk about things as, this is our proudest moment. We can do something together. Even if they volunteer, it gives people a sense that they can do something about the situation, and the sense of power reduces fear. If we could go to the next slide, please. Back to you, Jeff.
Okay, so as you look at the crisis management and preparing for unpredictable. If you could just kind of walk us through best practices as we're looking at slide 11 here, Daniel.
Yeah. So I think one thing that is very important in this particular example in the case of COVID-19, that makes it particularly challenging is to look at, what is it, there's some other aspect here that we need to put our finger on. And the aspect that we need to put our finger on has to do with the fact that our expectations of what good conduct and bad conduct is during this context changes. So here's what I mean by that. When we are in a crisis that has a national health emergency or a terrorist attack or natural disasters, we're shifting our perception. This is important. We're shifting what's appropriate and how do we respond appropriately. We saw some examples about how to do this on trust and on risk, but there's another dimension here that's super important to recognize in the case of COVID-19. What's happening specifically here, again, this is true not for all crises. It's not true for quality problem. It's not true for for an earnings restatement, but it is true whenever the entire community feels attacked, that what is appropriate and what's not appropriate is changing. So what's happening is we're changing from a typical business orientation, what I call the exchange orientation, to a community orientation. What does that mean? You can see this in a simple example. If you go to a restaurant and you have a great time with your friends, those were the days, and you have a bottle of wine and you're talking, and then at the end of the meal, what you do is you ask for the check, you give them your credit card, you leave a 20% tip. That's what we call an exchange orientation. What that means is people exchange services and goods for money in a market transaction. Very commonly, that's how businesses operate. Now take another example. Let's say the same group of friends was invited at a dinner at a friend's house. Same thing, same conversation, they had a great time. And now one of the guests asks for a check and leaves a $20 tip for the hostess on the table. It would be totally inappropriate. And people say, oh my God, it's terrible. What are you doing? Well, why is that? Because when we have dinner together at a friend's house, we are sharing it as a community. It's not a market transaction. You're not paying for the dinner. You show your appreciation in a different way by giving a compliment, for bringing a bottle of wine, for bringing flowers. So what's appropriate and what's not appropriate changes, whether it's a market transaction, whether it's a community orientation. What happens in the COVID-19 crisis, in every crisis that hits an entire community, terrorist attack, natural disaster, public health crisis, we shift to a community orientation, which means that companies now act as helpers of the community. I call this the good Samaritan principle. They need to be competent and caring, So it's by competent as helpers. So this is important. It doesn't have anything to do with their core competency. If you're a beauty products company, this is not about bringing skin moisturizer. This is about bringing water or whatever is needed in a natural disaster. In the case of COVID-19, you saw this when the car companies were switching their manufacturing facilities towards building respirators. You saw when Gilead was giving their product away for free. That's how we expect people to act competently and caring. And don't forget that this connects to something we said before, that this is an opportunity for our people to shine, for your people to shine, and to bring them in as part of a community response where we're all in this together. Let me conclude, Jeff, with one example. If you could go to the last slide. There are various examples that we see in the context of COVID-19, but we don't really quite know yet exactly about what the best examples are. Some businesses I think did a nice job, but the whole story hasn't been told yet. But a really fantastic example of putting this Good Samaritan principle in action is Walmart's response to Hurricane Katrina. And what the CEO at the time, Lee Scott, told his people, he said, this is a moment that is unusual. This is a moment of crisis. And we will ask you to do things that otherwise we wouldn't ask you to do. And we have confidence that you can do this. This is a moment for everyone to step up, and we're asking you to do that. So what that meant is that they were asking their store managers, for example, to do everything possible to provide whatever was needed in the community. They also set up kind of mobile response unit that were adjusted, where they had trucks pre-packaged with the necessary commodities that could then be moved around depending on where the hurricane was hitting, and so that people could get the goods right away. That's the competence part. But the empathy part, the caring part, is expressed here in these stories. So Walmart, interestingly, allowed their frontline people, their store managers, and their truck drivers to talk directly to the press. That's very unusual for any company. It's super unusual for Walmart. But look at these stories. It broke my heart to see them like that. They were my parents of my kids' sports teams. They were my neighbors. This is a store manager who broke into her pharmacy to provide that much needed diabetes medication to one of her customers, or the truck driver. When I arrived, it sounded like somebody scored a touchdown. I could have sat there, shook hands all day. They were so happy to see me. Notice the community orientation. Notice the focus on providing competent help. It's like the cavalry is arriving. And now let me conclude with one more insight here. Put yourself now in the head of the truck driver. This moment will be this person's proudest moment. It will be the most important moment of his professional life. And he will tell his grandchildren about what he felt and what it felt like to be there and provide water and other much needed goods to an affected area. That's a way to engage your people in a profound way, and that creates a community orientation that can last for a very long time. Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. And each one of those examples, and there's thousands of them, as we've seen throughout COVID-19, one clearly showing empathy, transparency, expertise, and commitment. And these are the times when you see companies and friends and neighbors, stepping up during times of crisis, and this is what they're remembered by. So thanks for sharing your insights, Daniel. So let's move forward. And so Daniel's going to remain as far as the Q&A session, but wanted to turn now to Renata Elias. So Renata is Vice President, as I mentioned, in Marsh's Risk Consulting Strategic Risk Practice. And Renata, what has the pandemic shown us about the need for businesses to be prepared for the unknown? Over to you, Renata Elias.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So let's talk about a few things. First, you want to be ready and prepared and understand that really crises come in a variety of shapes and sizes, as well as multiples. So if you think about, we've had COVID since February, March. The last 3-4 weeks, we've had civil unrest and protesting, and now we're into hurricane season. And let's not even talk about the impending wildfire season. So just understanding that you need to be ready, you need to be prepared so that you're able to respond to any type of crisis situation that you may come against. A crisis, it's really important to understand, a crisis can be a defining moment for your organization. I always say it's not necessarily the incident that you will be remembered for, but rather how you responded. The way you respond can ultimately impact your brand and reputation. I think the past few months has reinforced the need to be prepared. In other words, you have to be proactive and not reactive. There's more pressure today from boards and C-suites everywhere. So it's really time to put a plan of action into getting your crisis management capability developed and enhanced. It doesn't matter the size of your organization. It doesn't matter what industry you are, where you're located in the country. A crisis can fall into any one of your laps at any time. And expectations are also high from response from your employees. Your employees have high expectations. They want to hear from senior leadership. They want to know what your organization is doing during these times. Let's also remember that this unique times we're going through with COVID has been different than any other crisis, in that, if you think about it, it's affected each one of us on the call today, both personally and professionally.
Okay, so Renata, what can organizations do to more effectively manage crises? Over to you, Renata Elias.
Thank you. Yes. So let's start talking about that a crisis is not by definition, is not business as usual. Executive leadership may be used to working together, meeting 2-3 times a week. However, crisis will add layers and layers of complexity to your already strong working relationship. I remember speaking to one organization and they said, "Hey, Renata, we don't need a crisis management process. We don't need a team. We do it all the time." That's when you need to have that process, because if you've ever been in an adrenaline situation when something has happened, I always say calmer heads do not prevail. So have a plan. Also, I want you all to look at your organization's resilience. And when I say that, I know a lot of you may golf, you may live in rainy cities, so think of your resilience umbrella for your organization. The tip of your umbrella is your crisis management team, and every spoke of your umbrella represents a different component of resilience, whether it's emergency response, business continuity, crisis communications, IT, DR, cyber response. The point is in order for you to keep dry in a rainstorm, you need to have a whole umbrella. In order for your organization to stay dry during a crisis, you need to have an umbrella that's whole, that doesn't have any broken spokes. So after today, go back and look at what your resilience umbrella looks like for your organization and see if there's any spokes that need fixing. Another thing is a successful crisis management capability must have executive buy-in. That is critical. It's really hard to tell your CEO that you need to have a strong crisis management capability when your CEO does not understand it or does not think it's necessary. Really important to get that buy-in. Also, putting together a crisis management planning group within your organization so that you can create this crisis management capability. This allows you to put your thoughts and concerns and your ideas into the plan and process to really so that you're allowed to meet your organizational needs and your culture. Because I always say every crisis management plan is not the same. It needs to be tailored to the way you as an organization operates. And once you've completed your crisis management plan, make sure it does not sit in the shelf or in these days sits up in the cloud. Make sure you train and exercise. Provide your crisis management team with the ability to be able to walk through scenario specific details. Talk about how you as an organization respond. What happens if you were confronted or had to handle multiple crises at a time? Test out that process that you put together. And last, I've actually been told or asked, said by many organizations, they say, "You know what, Renata, we've got an emergency response plan. We don't really need a crisis management plan." An emergency response plan is going to handle emergencies, life safety emergencies, but you also need a process that's going to be able to handle the reputational issues, the cyber breaches, the harassment issues, the regulatory investigations. So again, you could be dealing with the reputational issue, as I said, such as executive malfeasance. And therefore, a formalized process is really critical to help you as your organization navigate through those turbulent waters.
Great, thanks, Renata. And if we could advance to the next slide, and I have a question back to you, Renata. What lessons can businesses learn from the pandemic and other recent crises?
Well, there's a whole long list of lessons learned, but I will keep it to a few for you all today. Number one, fill in your capabilities gap. Once you've determined where your gaps are, then make sure you plug those holes so you don't get wet during the crisis. If we hit the second wave of pandemic, you're going to want to make sure that you look back at what you have, how you responded, identify those areas that could use improvement, and make sure you fix those moving forward. The other big one is be proactive. Don't be reactive. That is it has been a little bit more difficult during COVID-19 due to the fact that this is a new pandemic for all of us. So we're in some ways we are being a bit reactive. However, that being said, pandemic planning has been here for a long time. So making sure that you have that proactive thinking within your organization. Have clearly defined roles and responsibilities for your response teams. In other words, I don't want to see a chief executive officer grabbing the fire extinguisher and going to put out a fire in one of your buildings, but I also don't want to see one of your facility personnel heading into the boardroom and making those broader strategic decisions about your company operations in light of the crisis. So in other words, have those clearly defined roles and responsibilities for those different levels in your organization. Make sure your teams and plans are aligned and integrated. Should be no silos. And again, if you think about the umbrella, keeping it whole. So again, there should be no silos in your organization when it comes to response. Forecast, anticipate, and be decisive and swift in your response. Get on top of the situation before it gets on top of you. And always, I would say, ask yourself in the end, did we do the right thing to protect your people, your operations, assets, and in the end, your brand and reputation?
Excellent. Thanks, Renata. Now let's move forward to slide 16 if we can. That would be great. And finally, Renata, what are the main steps in building a crisis management plan?
Thank you, Jeff. Yes, in a perfect world, you should already have a crisis management plan ahead of the crisis. I get it, but it's not too late to start doing it now. Assemble an internal crisis management planning group to navigate through the planning process. If you can't do it internally, look outside to get individuals who can come in and help you put that plan together. Consider your range of risks facing your organizations. You really should identify and understand what risks that you may potentially face as a crisis or emerging issue. And these can be broken down in people risks, operational, security, technology, natural disasters, governmental, and legal and financial, for example. So when it comes to crisis management, there's a wide range of risks you should consider. And develop that process and that fits your organization and your senior leadership style. The process should always be the same regardless of the risk. This is not when we say you should have 10 different crisis management plans for each different risk. No, you need one crisis management plan and process to address any type of risk that you may be facing from a senior leadership level. And things when you're talking about that process, things you want to consider is how and when do we hear about things or a situation or issue? Or when or how will our crisis management team be able to convene? The last thing you want your CEO to come to you and say is, why did I read about our company having a problem on Twitter this morning? And I know risk managers, that's probably your one thing you just don't want to get that call. So in order to avoid those situations from happening, putting together that process so that your senior leadership is advised in a very timely manner so that they're able then to respond in a strategic fashion. And lastly, make sure that not only your senior leadership are aware and have the awareness and the comfortability to be able to execute on the crisis management plan, but also make sure your employees are aware of the program you have in place. I would say strength in numbers and information is powerful. So share that with your employees in your organization. Thank you, Jeff.
Okay, thank you so much, Renata. And so much of that blends with what Daniel shared with us and his insights as well, and how critical it is to have a crisis management plan in the times that we live right now, very challenging times. So thanks, Renata. And so that's all we have for the main part of our presentation today. And now we want to turn our attention to some of the questions that we've received from each and every one of you from the audience. And as a reminder, in addition to Dr. Daniel Diermeyer and Renata Elias, we also have with us Steve Frazier, and we also have Dennis Tierney and Greg Rodway from Marsh Risk Consulting, and Dr. Lorna Friedman of Mercer. And a reminder that you can ask your questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if we don't answer your questions today, we'll make sure to get back to you right away with responses. And if you prefer, please feel free to email your questions to questions@marsh.com, and we'll make sure to reply after the webcast. And as a reminder, we're going to be sharing the replay of the webcast. We'll get that out within the next 24 hours. I'll make sure to send that out to each of our participants. And also want to remind everyone that we're going to provide some higher level guidance on potential insurance issues, but it's also important to note that insurance coverage as well as claims considerations for each organization will be unique and based on policy wording and specific factual circumstances that may change and evolve over time. So it's important to be in regular contact with your Marsh representative and work together to address any potential claims issues that your organization may have. So listen, so we have a number of questions that are coming through on the live feed, but let's first go, this question I think is perfect for Daniel, Dr. Daniel Diermeyer, and then Renata, if you could jump in as well. What are some types of unpredictable risks that you see companies ignoring? So Daniel, if you could take that, and then Renata, if you could jump in as well. Over to you, Dr. Daniel Diermeyer.
Thank you, Jeff. So I think they come in two buckets. The first one is on the operational side, and Renata talked a lot about that. Those are the types of disruptions of our operations that we're really not thinking about in a deep way. I think, for example, the issue of health risks and maybe even pandemics. It's something that people thought about, but not anything of this magnitude, and certainly not anything that would shut down the entire economy. And there are other examples like that that can be, having to do with a national security aspect, a cyber risk, a whole variety of different things. But I think the other thing that's important for people to recognize is that even issues that they are familiar with can trigger a crisis type reaction. And that comes back to this, if you remember at the very beginning, when we talked about reputational risk that could be driven by media coverage. That I think is something companies underestimate because they think they're familiar with it, but what has changed is a particular aspect that drove this up from the standard area to the new one. So just to give one example, if you're a sports car company, accidents happen, and they're not a crisis. They're unfortunate, but they're not a crisis. But a few years ago, Porsche had a pretty severe crisis that had to do when they had an accident, and the person who was killed was an actor who had played in the movie The Fast and the Furious. Now, and here's why this became a problem for them, because he was playing an expert driver, so of course he must be able to drive a 911 GTS, which is a tough car to drive. So if even he can't do it, the car can't be safe. That was the way this whole perception played out. So in this particular case, what made this into a crisis was that it was a celebrity who was killed, and that particular celebrity actually, on top of everything, had a connection to sports car driving. So these are things that nobody will have specifically or unlikely to have in your specific crisis plans, but you need to develop a mindset as a leader to understand when the paradigm is shifting, when the expectations and the level of attention and how an issue is covered is changing. In my experience, this is something that executives really struggle with because they think about it exclusively as an operational issue, not one that requires a particular communication strategy.
Yeah, so I definitely agree, and things are being amplified by social media now more than ever. So Renata, do you want to share your insights as well?
Yeah, just a couple thoughts. First, a couple areas. So the first one, just that I think, and this is not necessarily unpredictable, but that you could have multiple risks hit you at once, or multiple crises hitting you at once. And that is very challenging for any organization to be able to navigate through that. I think we always think, well, we'll deal with one at a time. And today, we're seeing that that's not the case anymore. So keep that in consideration. I think the other one that has really come out into light over the past several weeks has been those crises involving members of organizations, employees that have come out and have been caught on social media making some comments, and now not only have they lost their job, but the organization is thrust into the limelight. And I think these were some unpredictable risks that we're seeing definitely more and more in the last several weeks of prominent executives and prominent business leaders who have made some comments and are now suffering the ramifications of those comments, but also the company is thrown into the limelight as well. So I think that would be another one that I would add is something different we're seeing these days.
Okay, great. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Renata. So the next question coming in, and I think this one's best for Dr. Lorna Friedman, if you could take the lead, and then Renata. What preparation should we be making for a possible next surge, and what are we missing? Over to you, Dr. Lorna Friedman.
Thank you, Jeff. So again, kind of stepping back, a reminder that federal guidelines have suggested a staged approach, right? Gradually allowing a return to activities based on local criteria, which include the prevalence, and we've certainly seen the map. There's a fair amount of variability there, hospital capacity, and the availability of testing. So progress from one stage to the next is predicated on maintaining a downward trend. So any signs of resurgence indicate that you need to reimpose restrictions. So with no vaccine or treatment in place, the virus is still in many communities and it's free to travel between them. So employers would be wise to keep their pandemic plans fresh and nearby. They need to create benchmarks based on the guidance, really understanding the number for prevalence, hospital and testing capacity for different sites, and what are the thresholds for both return and for exit. Certainly recheck policies in this interim. For instance, we know that paid sick leave decreases the transmission of influenza by 30%. It's a good time to review those, parental leave, FMLA. And lastly, what are we missing? We're missing burnout. Many of our employers say that they have very high levels of productivity during this time, both in office workers who are working at home as well as manufacturing. But we are pumping a lot of cortisol from a clinical perspective, and ultimately we will become depleted. So employers would be wise to make sure that they continue to have telemedicine services, ergonomics, and importantly, both mental health services and support for working parents in place. With that, I would turn it over to Renata.
Thank you, Lorna, and great. Those are absolutely great examples from a clinical perspective. I think what I'll just add to Lorna's great answer is really to start to look at, and Lorna mentioned the pandemic plan, but look at all your different other plans. So, crisis communications is such a huge part of a response to a pandemic, that communicating not only to your employers, but also to your vendors and stakeholders as well as your business continuity plans. This is a time to look at those, make those adjustments as necessary based on what you've learned over the last several months. I think you can use that moving forward. Again, keeping in mind, and I love Lorna talked about your people. Your people are your number one priority. They're your number one asset. So look back at those sort of the different people support that you've had and look at if there's any ways as we head into a possible second wave, or is there anything else that can be done really to support your employees during these times?
Okay, thank you, Lorna, and thank you, Renata. So this next question coming in, I think this is probably best directed, coming back at you, Lorna, and then Steve and Dennis, if you could jump in as well. What are the best practices if someone returns to work and then exposes other employees or customers to COVID-19? So what are best practices as well as recommendations that you have for employers dealing with a situation such as that scenario, exposing fellow workers and employees as well as customers to COVID-19? So that's the first part of the question. The second is, what responsibility do employers have to contact, trace, and notify customers, employees. So maybe Lorna, if you could take this question, then Steve and Dennis, if you want to jump in, that would be great.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And I'll take the clinical component and hand it over to my colleagues for their expertise. I think, as we've already commented, employers really need to have clear and defined protocols in this case, right? So, and it should be based on current CDC guidance, which has and may continue to change, right? This is the pathophysiology of this virus is still making itself clear to us, but additionally in regards to not only CDC guidance, clearly you also have to understand what the local public health guidance is in this regard. So the first thing you have to do is you have to look for cleaning and disinfection, and those recommendations are clear and on the CDC website. But clearly the question at hand is informing fellow employees of their possible exposure to COVID-19 in the workplace, but you certainly want to maintain confidentiality and align with the American Disabilities Act. So we highly advise that you seek counsel in regards to your policy, and you certainly wouldn't want to expose an individual's name. You know, because you're going to have to communicate to contacts and employee contacts, this is one reason why we see employers using different types of work shifts or limiting cohorts, and certainly limiting individuals, limiting the space in which people interact, so that if you do have a case, you're able to identify quickly who that case and who those individuals may have contacted and where they have in a physical space. Once employees have been exposed, if they were in close contact, and that's usually defined as 6 feet and roughly 10 to 15 minutes, those individuals should self-isolate and follow the CDC recommendations. Those who are potentially exposed but with no symptoms should remain at home or and practice social distancing. And then employees who are not considered exposed should still continue to self-monitor for symptoms and speak with their physicians and notify their supervisors. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Steve.
Thanks. I agree, that was excellent, and would only add what might be considered a sort of a legal gloss on the top of that. And I'll deal with third parties and customers. Whether before or after exposure, this is a standard tort analysis. You've got a duty to act with reasonable care to foreseeable victims. And the criteria for that, whether it's negligence or willful acts, will be judged in hindsight, unfortunately. So you consider your duty to protect, to warn, and prevent. Some states have more specific duties for business and property owners, but it's the same basic situation. Inspect, protect, warn of problems that wouldn't be apparent. And then on top of that, you have the gloss of the more general risk of the COVID virus and the specific awareness that a business owner may have about its business or its location. And it's very fact specific. Obviously, a hair salon, a law firm, a big box retailer, a power plant are different types of exposures, but it's all in the duty of a context to protect and warn. And essentially what you're saying to yourself is, do the right thing. It will be judged in hindsight. And if you know there's been exposure either to a customer, I think the first thing obviously is to talk to management, talk to legal, talk to your crisis team. You're going to need to notify, you're going to need to make efforts to notify, but you've got an underlay of privacy requirements, public health requirements. And so what we say on the front end of this in the prevention phase is to scrupulously follow government orders and recommendations, local, state, federal, because those set the minimum. If you're not at least doing that, you have severe issues if there's a problem and you wind up in the litigation system. And the similar on the back end, if there has been exposure, you're going to be working through the government. I mean, any individual business doesn't have the ability to contact trace. So you're with the government, you're cooperating, you're doing everything you can. And when we talk to our clients about this, what they're considering, you do a targeted closure of a site. Do you do public notice of that, or do you have the ability to actually trace individuals and identify? And all of that is so fact specific that beyond those general criteria, it's hard to create some sort of guideline that would apply to everybody. What you have to do is consider your situation, consider the overall risk that you run by not doing the right thing, by not protecting and warning, and then you have to act accordingly within the context of the crisis team that you've got in place. And that, again, that's customers, that's in third parties. And Dennis, I think, will have a slightly different take on the actual employees inside the organization. So I'll turn it over to him.
Thanks, Steve. So when we're talking about a potential workers' comp claim or potential exposure, if you're having an employee that's alleging an exposure to the virus within their course and scope of their employment, and they have symptoms that are related to COVID, it's going to be of utmost importance to get that claim reported right away to your claim provider. You want to make sure that a plan is in place with your claim provider as to who's going to be handling these claims and how they're going to be handled. You know, when they come in, there's going to be a pretty extensive investigation done. That investigation is going to be around symptoms. You know, when did the symptoms start happening, what the symptoms are, how long have they occurred? It's going to be based on medical. Do they have a positive test, or do they have a medical report from a doctor giving causal relationship to the workplace? And lastly, it's going to be about the exposure, right? I mean, did they have to take public transportation to work? Did they travel to a hotspot? Have they encountered anybody else that may have been positive? And all this stuff is going to be based on this investigation. That's how compensability will be determined in accordance also with the jurisdictional laws. I mean, Lorna hit on some of the really good things regarding communication. So I think communication is also important, letting your employees know the situation, what happened, how is the situation going to be remedied, what could we do to prevent the situation further, and also flexibility, right? Just the ability to give workers to work from home, and if there is a situation like that, just the flexibility to make sure that they feel safe.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Lorna and Steve and Dennis. Now I want to bring Greg into the conversation here. Greg Rodway, as a reminder, Senior Vice President, Workforce Strategies Practice of Marsh Risk Consulting. So Greg, if you can touch on this question, two parts, and then Lorna, if you want to jump in as well. What are best practices to support those working from home? So that's the first part of the question. Second part is, I'm interested in what other employers are doing to provide a safe work at home environment. So these questions are related to work at home. And Greg, if you could take these two questions, and then Lorna, feel free to jump in if you want.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Yes, it's an interesting time, isn't it? Because in the last few months, we've seen a really big increase in the number of people working remotely, working from home. And the majority of people that have been put in that category too haven't really had the experience of doing that in the past. So it's very, very new to them. So I think the best practice for employers now is to actually extend your risk assessment. So when you're looking at your safety plan for the year, you would do a risk assessment, which would look at the hazards in the environment, but then the controls that you have in place to control those hazards. So now we need to look more broadly and think about, well, these additional hazards exist in workplaces that are in homes? And consequently, what are the controls that we can put in place to address those hazards? Now, given that many of the hazards have a musculoskeletal component, really relating to ergonomic causes, then it's important then to consider, well, what support can we give to our employees who are working from home that have never had this experience really, and are going to probably be working from home for many more months? How can we help them control some of the hazards in their environment? So clearly there's an opportunity to raise awareness. And I think, Lorna was speaking about that more broadly when talking about, more awareness about the COVID-19 response. but actually raising awareness too that there are existing hazards, whether COVID-19 is present or not, in the workplace when you're working from home. So that'd be more along the lines of some ergonomic hazards. So, you know, raising awareness, and then companies are actually then conducting or providing virtual training, which is customized to their environment, which talks about what can I do as an individual when I'm working from home to set up a safe environment. Then sometimes that is insufficient. So to go to another level is actually to organise a virtual assessment, which would mean looking at a customised series of recommendations for an individual about how they could work more safely at home. So in some ways, what we're suggesting and what we're seeing and what we're acknowledging are best practices in the workplace that companies are now doing is to include working from home as part of their risk assessment, and then including in the controls that are put in place to provide people the opportunity to learn how to work safely from home to reduce their ergonomic risks. And so whether it's COVID-19 or not, whatever the cause, working from home is an area that raises additional hazards and controls that can be put in place to reduce them. But over to you, Lorna.
Thanks, Greg. So just really briefly, and kind of to put this experiment in perspective, you know, we do, prior to COVID in the US, 8% of employees work from home, and really only 2% work full-time. Our own Mercer surveys showed that really only about 20% of companies were thinking about increasing flexible work. And now clearly we have companies publicly like Facebook and Twitter saying, actually, we're going to just have permanent state of work. So we see them increasing virtual learning platforms, which include how to manage your time, how to manage your home distractions, virtual health platforms, certainly, as well as really training managers on how to touch base for management skills. That said, I do want to comment, and particularly with the use of the word safe. One of the things we've also seen as a result of work from home is an increase in domestic violence calls. And we see this across every country, across every state, and across every county and socioeconomic demographic. So home is not safe for everyone. And employers would be wise to articulate and kind of bring this issue out of the shadows. Thanks.
Okay, great. Excellent. Thanks, Lorna, and thanks, Greg. So we have time for one more question, and I'm thinking this question is actually best directed to Daniel and then Renata. So the question is, please highlight how best to structure after-action meetings to improve an organization's programs based on crisis learning. So after we've gone through this crisis, what is the best way to structure an after-action review in order to learn from that and build those learnings into a new crisis management plan going forward? So Daniel, if you can share your insights, and then Renata, if you want to jump in, that would be great. Over to you, Dr. Daniel Diermeyer.
Thank you, Jeff. I make a couple of comments at it. The first one, you want to do an after-action review, whether things worked out or they didn't work out. We're learning both from successes and from failures. And so it's very important to do both of that, even if you felt that you did a good job, because then you want to know why you did a good job and whether there is some additional things you want to learn from that. The second piece is that after action reviews are scary situations for the people that were part of the effort. So you want to really avoid blaming or pointing fingers at this point, because you need to create a learning environment, not an environment where you're blaming people individually. If there were specific things that did not go well, individual, and you have to take some actions on that, you want to do that separately. So the most important thing is to really structure this as a learning environment. It also can be useful to bring a third party into that to just give a new perspective, particularly as you're thinking about improving your resilience and your crisis response.
Okay, Renata, your thoughts?
Wow, I couldn't have said it much better than that, Daniel. But anyway, yes, so I agree wholeheartedly with Daniel. Taking the time, whether you're with your teams, to look, and again, look at really what, give yourselves a pat on the back, but then also identify where are there areas that we can improve. I always like to tell people, the best plan, the best run exercise, the best response, you're still going to be able to find areas for improvement. So definitely putting then the action plan together once you've had that debriefing with your teams, put that action plan together with some timelines. This is really best practice for improvement. It is kind of the plan, do, check, act. So again, it should be worked into every response, every exercise. And again, making it a positive learning experience is really important as well. It does not have to be daunting, even though it sometimes is perceived as that. So very important for the continuum of an overall capability.
Okay, thank you, Renata, and thank you, Daniel. And I wanted to say thank to each and every one of our panelists today for sharing your insights. And again, it remains a very challenging time. So I think sharing this information during time could be helpful to every one of the organizations who are participating on this webcast. So I just want to bring it all to a close because we covered a lot of ground. So you should, this is to each one of our participants, you should receive an email within the next 24 hours with information on how to access the replay of the webcast, as well as I'll provide a copy of the slides from today's program. And for information and insights on how to aid in your response to the pandemic, please visit our dedicated COVID-19 microsite at coronavirus.marsh.com. And there you can download a copy of our new report on why a public-private partnership to develop a pandemic risk solution is essential for recovery as well as businesses moving forward. And you can also stay current on the thought leadership offerings and other Marsh news by following us at Marsh Global, so quote unquote Marsh Global on Twitter. And if you have any questions about how you can manage the impacts of the pandemic, please don't hesitate to reach out to your Marsh representative. And wanted to say thanks again to each and every one of you for joining us today. We covered a lot of ground and a very challenging time for all of us. And thanks for joining us. And please follow up directly with any questions that you have following the session. Thanks, everybody. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Okay.